So I've seen technology from every side as a vendor, an operator, a developer, an analyst, and a buyer. People seem to value that unique outlook of all sides of this industry. And on the left here are a few of the places where I've been interviewed or had articles published. So enough about me. This is a story in 3 chapters. I'm going to start with how this crazy idea got into my head. And then it's time to talk about what can be done by combining 2 products in the right way. And then finally, let me offer a few hints on getting started. In a previous life, I drew up capacity plans for the national computer centers. And it was hard to gather the numbers, but the prediction was easy. We'd just chart out where the trend was going and then flag when it would hit 80% of capacity, plan to upgrade or buy more capacity at that time. No, I mean, really, 80% was our rule of thumb, not customer experience or response times. These were simpler days. And in a more recent role, we migrated to cloud. And of course, when you migrate to cloud, the costs go down, right? Well, not at first. You see, we had delays because we were waiting for extra EC2 instances to power up and customers complained. So we defaulted all the instances to run warm, and that kind of raised our costs over our plans a little bit. But we eventually worked it out, right? And there's a common theme through these things, from whether it's mainframes or cloud microservices, and that is guesswork. In a complicated world, we are guessing our way into the future. What if we could find some certainty among the chaos? This is where the story begins. And if you want a short version of this session, here it is. I saw the statement and I wondered, what does this number would have been for applications that I owned in previous jobs? And I realized chaos computing and application performance monitoring could come together to tell me that. So that's the short version. Let's explore in a little more detail. See, this number comes from Mr. Linden at Amazon. It's public from a few years back. That's why I use it. Amazon calculated that every 100 milliseconds of delay in a transaction cost about 1% of sales. Now, how significant is 1% of revenue? Well, it depends. But for simplicity, imagine your application brings revenue in equally through every day, every minute, every year, right, throughout the year. Then this 1% revenue loss would be the equivalent of a 1% outage within the year. So a 100 millisecond delay undetected and running for a full year is equivalent to an 87.6 hour outage. So what happens if we make it 100 milliseconds faster? Was the second question that sort of bubbled up in my head. Does revenue go up by 1%? And I realized I did not calculate capacity in this way because back in those days, I didn't have the tools to calculate these impacts. So what do we need to do that? Well, we need 2 things. A dial, an easy way to adjust the infrastructure resources so that you can experiment. And yes, for pop culture fans, this image relates to both a fun movie from many years ago and also can be correlated to a cool sci-fi show from about 4 years ago. Anyway, forget the dial. What's the other thing you need? You need the meter, a way of knowing the impact of adjusting the dial. I mean, you could turn the knob down and wait for the complaining phone calls, but the smarter move would be to have a meter that sees what is happening. Now, if only there was a world where these 2 things existed for applications. Now, that brings me to chaos computing. Now, I get that chaos computing is really about experimentation. And though that term scares a lot of business folks, life would be a little easier if we called it experimental computing, right? But, well, then the chaos monkey would become the experimental monkey, and well, that's not a good image. Let's not go there. But what we're looking for here, the dial, becomes the ability within a tool like Gremlin that allows you to adjust for CPU and storage and response time and so on. And the meter, well, the meter is application performance monitoring, easily allowing us to compare the outcomes. With Gremlin and AppDynamics together, you have the tools you need to do these sorts of experiments. So you don't need to use the 80% rule. And that brings me to testing. Traditionally, we think about the sort of testing in 2 ways, right? Load and volume. Glenford Mayers talks about this in the book, The Art of Software Testing. What do these mean? Well, I think about them in terms of like eating Vegemite sandwiches. You want to see how many Vegemite sandwiches you can deal with. And the first is, how many Vegemite sandwiches can you fit in your mouth at one time? That's the load test, right? And then what about the volume test? Well, that would be if you imagine a waiter is delivering plate after plate of Vegemite sandwiches to your table. while you're eating them, how long before the table fills up? So the thing is that I skipped breakfast this morning so that I wouldn't burp during this presentation, and now I feel like a Vegemite sandwich. But anyway, where should we enact these sorts of tests, right? If you don't have Vegemite sandwiches. So what you want to do, I would say, start with the code that your customers use most often. So you look with your application performance monitor to tell you where that is. Now, monitoring has recently evolved to observe what the code does for users, what they actually use, and where they abandon your code. You see that in the sort of chart here. Now, because you can drill down from this to the related infrastructure, you can track from here to where you need to experiment to find the dial that you want to adjust, right? Which one is actually going to have an impact? What is the constriction? And that's the first place to begin. Now, this sort of caution of working out where to begin goes a little against the concept of chaos computing, but it's because it's not totally chaotic or random. But remember, I'm just suggesting this as a hint for finding a starting point. What we're not doing, like for this conversation today, we're not seeking resiliency. We're seeking capacity. In science, we postulate a theory and then we experiment to see if our theory holds out or not. And that means postulations. So let's call them outcome statements. You can create outcome statements and then experiment to load in the values. For straight out testing, load and volume, it might be, we can handle up to X transactions before the system breaks. We can handle up to Y transactions per minute for 3 hours or Z hours without jamming the system up. Now, you know when to start getting scared with increasing workload, but you also need to know where the restraints are in order to do anything about it. Without knowing the constraint, you don't know where to go. So this is fine for sort of load and volume testing, but what we need is something about capacity and revenue correlation. We need to ask different questions. Remember, what we're trying to do, again, is correlate capacity to performance, to revenue, and its customer experience. Here are some of the outcome statements that might help with that. Maybe you are over-allocating capacity. You might be wasting resources and money. So playing with your Kubernetes cluster, add and remove pods. Go big, change it by 20%, see what happens. Get measures of what happens when you give it less or more. Try this at a pod level. Reducing each pod memory by, Y% increases the checkout transaction time by X milliseconds. You should understand on both parameters, by reducing capacity and increasing capacity, how that impacts your environment. It might be that you can generate more revenue by allowing more transactions to occur, if that is the bottleneck. You correlate these performance measures to customer experience. So, at 100 millisecond response time, we see 20% abandons or a 15% increase in tickets. So I can't give you real examples here because they're the property of the companies I work with, but giving you a couple of quick samples here to hopefully steer you in the right direction. You don't just want it to be a system metric. You want to tie it back to customer experience and or revenue. Now, depending on your business, yes, you're correlating these to revenue like Amazon did. Improve response time by this, increase revenue by that. So be thinking about that as you go through this process. Now, of course, you need solid sort of application performance monitoring alongside your chaos manager to be able to do this. But you needed that anyway for blue-green testing and canary testing and version compares and transaction tracing and bringing all the melt together so you have observability and visibility of your environment. We need to use chaos to find failures and slowdowns. And that means monitoring around the chaos. So I propose, blue-green has a new meaning, chaos certainty. But why stop there? Your first tests are resiliency tests. Black hole a container and see if the application survives. Fill up a storage volume, see if the application survives. But once you know the code is resilient, go one step further. Instead of failing one container, quiesce 20% of your containers. Remember, you've already tested for failure. So now you're testing for capacity. Do the users change their behavior as a result? Modern APM can even show you whether users are taking different journeys through your application, which piece of code they abandon at. So in this example, we sort of see that the slow service has reduced checkout volume by 59%. You're now getting certainty around your capacity. not only do you know the outcome of your test on behavior, you know where to go in the application to address it. So, but why stop there? You might find other sorts of certainty. So two things. Clearly, you need something that I did not have when I was doing capacity planning, an easy tool for adjusting the dial. That's where our host today, Gremlin, comes in. Alongside it, you need some serious application performance monitoring, like My Home App Dynamics, something that can correlate the code to the capacity, to the performance or customer experience and revenue. Right? So code, capacity, performance, customer experience or revenue. Connecting Gremlin app, sorry, stumbling over my words here. I'm too excited about this. Connecting Gremlin and App Dynamics is so powerful that actually our communities beat us to this. I found this man in Australia, and in Australia, a gentleman named Pratik Shachan is my current hero. And he shared how to see the Gremlin experiment status inside App Dynamics. In case you got distracted during my session, now is the time to come back and take a screenshot of this, right? This is the code bit. At the very bottom, I'll give you a shortened link at the end of the presentation, and that has his description and everything on it. For people, if you already have Gremlin and App Dynamics in place, try it out. Let me know how it goes. With that said, all right, so that's great. So what are the next steps? How should you find certainty among chaos? As I said, you need the right tools first: Chaos Manager, Modern Application Performance Monitoring, or APM. In your enterprise, start small with one application, or perhaps a few key business transactions. Keep in mind that you are building out a practice, something that others can follow. So share back with the community like my hero Pratik did. Define your outcome statements. Make sure that they are something you can react to, you can take an action about. And then, it can be easy to be distracted just trying to satisfy idle curiosity and playing with the knobs sort of thing. A good APM will dynamically baseline your environment anyway. So make sure it also allows you to track user experience and customer behavior and revenue. The correlation of these together is what is so powerful with this concept. Remember, you want to have certainty about your capacity. What happens if you go low? What happens if you go high? With that, you're going to know what will happen if you lose capacity and where you can increase capacity to improve things in an emergency, right? So something going wrong, the transaction to being constrained for a reason, from your prior testing, well, the first thing is let's just allocate some more memory to the pods because we identified that released things up in the past, or you've used your APM to identify the constraint. The Goldilocks principle, right? You want the best tuned environment. You want the porridge that is just right. So yes, I skipped breakfast. I'm still thinking about breakfast, I admit it. So by the way, this practice is not just good for your application and enterprise. It's good for your career too. Research by the DevOps Institute identified experience with performance and monitoring is a must-have for 39% of employers. So I'm going to put this up. There's a few links on here. Again, a good time to swap back and take a quick screenshot. This is some further reading for you. I recommend checking out Slowdown as the new outage. But with that, I want to thank you for your time this morning, and we'll move ahead to questions. And of course, during the next few hours, I'll be in the chat room to take questions there as well.
That was such a great talk. I took a little note that I love that part where you were just talking about like you're seeking capacity, not resiliency, and then how you talk about that blast radius where you're testing for resiliency, and as you expand that blast radius, you're just going for what exactly is my customer seeing and asking the right questions. And of course, when you talk about that hero that we have that is able to actually bring together App Dynamics and Gremlin, like that is like such a beautiful flow that I love when we see those integrations happen in the community when it's not driven by us. And it's like, cool, you figured it out, you understand the value, and now you're sharing with the community, going back to that principles of chaos engineering where like we follow the scientific method, but that last one is all about sharing your results, your failures, your progress. So I'm going to move on to Q&A.
Go ahead.
We have the first question. This is the most serious question I'm going to ask you. How many Vegemite sandwiches can you fit in your mouth?
Well, I will admit I haven't tried it as an adult. As a kid, so what you do with a Vegemite sandwich is you cut them into triangles, right? And you stack the triangles up in three triangles. Nice. As a kid at school.
that might be my hobby for next month. I still have never had a Vegemite sandwich, but I work with a few Australians that are always talking about how great it is. And I'm like, all right, I got to get on that.
Here's the quick hint. I was always going to include this in the presentation of like, start small. A bit like deploying the concept of chaos for capacity. It's just like a very fine smear. It's not peanut butter, man. It's just like do a very fine smear first and then see. Anyway,
next question.
Yes.
What metrics do you find useful for automated systems? The systems that users do not directly interact with.
So if I understand the question correctly of like, how does the integration work? Like how do we connect to other things to gather information from them and to push actions out to them? Is that what the question was?
Yeah, so they want to know kind of like when you have automated systems that the users are not like, they're not customer facing. So what metrics would you actually say that folks should be tracking in order for them to understand what's going on?
Oh, I think I get it now. So if it's if it's not specifically revenue or customer based, what do you use? It's still the user experience, right? If it's an internal application that you've just written inside your company, and the only people that use it are people inside your company, fellow employees, it's the same measure. It's the user experience. That's why I was sort of making the point of connecting, code to capacity to code to performance to capacity to user experience or revenue. If it's a public-facing thing and you're making money from it, then you get the 1% revenue hit. If it's an internal thing, maybe it's tickets. You might go, okay, I crank the performance down. Do we start getting people raising tickets because they're now unhappy with the application?
Yeah, and I think you touch upon an interesting point. Many folks don't realize that their internal tools end up being customer facing, and sometimes the questions are like, how do we put metrics on internal tools, or like, how do we make sure those are up? And it's like, your engineers, they're your customers. Like, you got to make sure they're always up.
My personal opinion is everyone who's not me is a customer. So even when I'm writing code, like the person who's going to have to maintain that code when, if I move to another job, they're my customer too. Have I left them enough information that they can easily maintain it? Everyone's a customer.
That is very true. Our next question, I love this one. Where do you get the information from revenue? What is the source of truth usually?
So the source of truth is a great way of putting it, right? And what you need is to sort of develop a single source of truth. A decade ago, before DevOps started, we had silos and everybody would fight with their own monitor and argue about, well, my monitor says this, and the network monitoring tool says this, and the database monitoring tool says that. So bringing that together into a sort of that's been the success of application performance management. Is bringing all that together, and then we identified fairly quickly that we were bringing. We had agents and SDKs and all these things feeding in the information, and now, of course, it's open telemetry and things like that. Or bringing all of this information in, or observability tools, we bring it into this APM. But then you need to sort of go. We realized that all that information was great, but we needed to tie it to the business. So we started by, and this is a number of years ago, started by going into business transactions. Again, an application isn't a standalone thing. It's a group of business transactions together. And I say business, and again, whether that's an internal application or an external, it doesn't mean revenue. It just means, it's supporting your business somehow, your company, enterprise somehow. We brought it all together, we laid business transactions. And one of the requests that came back fairly quickly was like, well, hang on, to do, distributed tracing on those transactions and things like that, you're looking at each transaction. Can we extract data out of that as each transaction goes by? And in App Dynamics, we said, yes, that's business IQ. That's what we build as an option. So we're looking at each transaction and, identifying, if it's revenue you're looking for, here's the revenue piece. If it's customer experience, like that journey map thing, then, it's the customer or user experience. So it's coming from the data as it flows through your environment.
Yes, I love that answer. It's like part from it of just being like one point of truth, but also just looking at that data. Like we are talking about data-driven decisions at the end of the day. I know we have a few more questions coming in, but we're up for time. So we're going to post the rest of Marco's questions that are coming in over at the QA channel for Marco. But we would love to thank you for being one of our speakers and, of course, starting our morning, following up the conversation from tacos to now Vegemites.
Yeah, well, breakfast, right? Now I can eat, but I finished presenting. Thanks so much for hosting me, Anna.
Thank you, Marco.
Cheers.